Welcome back. I'm Stephen Drunsic. This is Q&A Live. Today I am very fortunate to have a very special guest on our show today. This individual is currently the president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. He's is a recipient of a number of awards. He is a PhD electrical engineer from UC Berkeley, and he has appeared on ABC, CBS, CNN, BBC, NPR, and a host of other media locations. I am fortunate right now to have Dr. Arjun Makhijani joining me. Thank you for being on with me. Pardon me, I'm a little bit nervous. It's not normally I get someone of your caliber on my show.
Oh, please, no, I'm a down-home guy from way down south in Bombay.
Oh, way down south in Bombay. Well, you know, it's, I understand that you're in the area. You're doing a workshop series, and it's very fortunate of us to be able to have you on. I just want to review, you've got quite an esteemed career. You've got 37 years of experience in the nuclear and electrical fields. You're currently the president, as I said before, the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. Maybe you could just give me a little bit of background as to you know, how you've gotten to where you are now.
Yeah, when I started my doctoral work in Berkeley in 1970, 44 years ago nearly now, I attended a seminar by Professor Pigford, who was a professor of nuclear engineering. I had come from industry into the doctoral program. And he gave a lecture on nuclear energy, all the problems with nuclear energy and the pluses and minuses, the uranium mining, the pollution, all that. And then he also did the same with coal, and he said, well, coal is obviously worse, and we should build 1,000 nuclear power plants in the next 30 years. Mm-hmm. And I had just come from industry where, you know, I'd been involved as an electrical engineer and helping design uranium mills, and I thought, we didn't have any radiation protections, you know, and so I started questioning myself. And so I said, well, why do we need 1,000 nuclear power plants? And nobody among the best and the brightest at Berkeley had an answer. So I was the principal author of the first efficiency study, the first study of U.S. efficiency potential. Can we do all the same things and live as well, but with much less energy? And that was in 71, and so I've never looked back since. I think that we can do it better, we can do it cleaner, we can do it more efficiently, and we're still in pursuit of that goal.
Well, I think it was Lewis Strauss, who was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, who at one point said the benefits of nuclear were such that it was almost too cheap to meter.
Yeah, he said one day it would be too cheap to meter. And so we actually researched that at the Institute, because I was very curious as to where it came from and why it was said. At first I thought it must have been a mistake, you know, in the early days people thought it would be very cheap. But I was kind of shocked to find that even at that time, the technical assessments done by the Atomic Energy Commission, by MIT, by industry, all said that nuclear energy would be expensive rather than too cheap to meter. And there wasn't anything structural that pointed the way to too cheap to meter.
Now wait, now let me just hold you. When you say expensive, are they accounting for the expenses associated with decommissioning?
No.
Negative externalities?
This was just pure conventional economics. What will the uranium cost? What will the reactor cost? You know.
Sure.
And comparing it to coal, where also there were no externalities, no climate, no CO2,
that
no
was the
nothing.
only peer group at the time, was coal.
Yeah, coal, it was coal and nuclear. And most of the studies concluded nuclear would be more expensive than coal at the very time that Lewis Strauss was saying this. And we discovered that nuclear power was really the fig leaf over the horror of hydrogen bombs. After the hydrogen bombs in '53, Eisenhower wanted to convey a positive spin on the nuclear business. He gave his Atoms for Peace speech. The United States didn't want others to have nuclear weapons, so he said, well, if you don't have nuclear weapons, we'll show you this wonderful way to prosperity. Right. There was a long propaganda campaign, and they called it propaganda at the time. It's not something that I'm putting in their mouths. So it wasn't born very well, nuclear energy, in terms of public policy.
Now, of course, you grew up in the Cold War era.
But in India.
But in India.
Right.
Which has the nuclear bomb.
Right.
I guess one of the interesting points that I just want to highlight is that not a lot of people probably know this, but are you familiar with the megatons to megawatts
Yes, I am.
policy? And we can probably touch on that a little bit later,
Sure.
but the fact that I think, what is it, 4% of electricity consumed in the United States is fueled by reprocessed Russian nuclear warheads.
Yes. And I think that's a good thing.
Yes, I think it is a good thing, too, although that program's just come to a halt.
Right.
So, well, I know that, you know, you have won a number of awards. You're a Plowshare's Hero. You've won the Jane Badgley Lehman Award, the Josephine Butler Nuclear Award. And in 2007, you came out with a book called Carbon-Free and Nuclear-Free,
Right.
Roadmap for U.S. Energy Policy.
I'm sorry I didn't bring a copy to
I
hold
wish you
up.
had brought a copy for
But you
us
know,
all.
you can download my book free
Okay.
from our website.
Here's your plug right
If
now.
you go to IEER.org
Okay.
and you go into our Carbon-Free Nuclear-Free campaign or into our list of publications, you can download Carbon-Free and Nuclear-Free for free.
Okay.
It doesn't cost you a thing. If you buy a hard copy, you have to pay for it, but you can have an electronic copy for nothing.
Okay, well,
it's
that's
been
good to know.
downloaded hundreds of thousands of times.
Well, I certainly wish I had the time. My predecessor, Bob Stannard, who used to occupy this chair,
Right, I knew him.
used to say he would never bring any paperwork. I'd say, what did you do to prepare for an interview? And he said, I didn't prepare. I didn't bring any paperwork.
Yeah.
Well, here I am with a stack of paperwork.
And you see, I have
And
none.
because, you know, this topic is so broad and there's so many issues that we could talk about today. And so I got this is kind of an ode to Bob Stannard.
Yeah.
But I did do a little bit of research on your book, and I know there's
Right.
some interesting statistics. You would like to be 90% carbon-free by 2050.
Yeah, and nuclear-free.
And nuclear-free.
More than 90%.
Well, and this is interesting because, you know, you're sitting here as a nuclear scientist. We're talking about a carbon-free environment, and yet some of those proponents of nuclear energy might say, well, that's a very clean source of energy.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of an issue there you have to reconcile, I guess, in your
Right.
head to some extent.
Yeah, so every energy source has its pluses and minuses. It's not that renewables are they don't have any issues. Every energy source, so long as you're flipping the light switch, so long as you're burning something, you're going to have some environmental impact. You're going to have some cost impact. The question is, who's paying these costs? On whom are you going to have this impact? How long is it going to last?
Are we
Is it
accounting for all-
reversible?
Mhm.
Yeah. So here are our energy choices, philosophically speaking. We can freeze in the dark. We don't want to do that.
Some people are freezing in the dark right now, probably.
Right. Okay. So, but that's an undesirable condition.
Right.
We wouldn't choose to freeze. Here are our choices. So we wouldn't choose to freeze in the dark. We can burn fossil fuels, which creates not only carbon dioxide and all the climate issues, but most of the air pollution comes from fossil fuel combustion, from vehicles, from coal burning, acid rain, all that. Nitrogen oxides, mountaintop removal. The carbon monoxide in your home, if you cook with gas, for instance, could be an issue in many homes. I've been researching it recently. So fossil fuels have lots of issues. Principal cause, or one of the principal causes of respiratory diseases, asthma, and so on. Plus, I think the climate, I don't think you should call it global warming. I don't
agree.
think we should call it climate change. It is severe climate disruption. To call it global warming, I often tell people, you know, you've got your head in the oven, and you got your feet in the freezer, and then you say, I have a slight temperature increase on the average. Well, that's not the main thing. It's the extremes, and the extremes are going up as a result of the slight, and the net
Sure.
temperature increases is rather modest. It doesn't seem like a whole lot, you know.
And this is important to bring up now because, you know, we're in the throes of this polar vortex, and of course you've got
Right.
some media outlets that are using this as an example of, you know, saying to those who have been talking about global warming that, hey, well, you know, we've got record low temperatures. Of course, this is a
Right.
result of climate change, anthropogenic climate change,
Right.
man-made.
That's why I call it climate disruption.
Climate disruption,
So
okay.
I'm not a climate scientist, but I do note that the Arctic is warming up. a lot. The ice over there has melted. So the meteorological conditions over the Arctic are now no longer the same. The 2007 was a threshold year where things kind of almost like fell off a cliff in terms of the area of the Arctic that melted in the summer. There were all these curves.
30%
Everything is
loss
going
in
along.
sea ice, I believe.
Everything is going along as if all the climate models were right. You know, the people who say the climate models are very inaccurate are right, but mostly they're not right about the direction of the that's right.
Sure.
They're too conservative. So they were predicting Arctic ice melting in 100 years, and it's happening in 20 or 10.
And exponential.
So I don't know whether it's linked to the Arctic being warmer, but it may be. But we have disrupted the meteorological patterns in a massive way by warming up the oceans, by acidification of the oceans, by changing the land and rainfall patterns. We're going to have more rainfall on average, but there are lots of places that will have more drought on average, like California right now.
More extreme events.
More extreme is the proper way to think about it.
And it's interesting because I think you're starting to see a recognition, particularly even among multinationals, for instance, Coca-Cola in your own country, in India.
Yeah.
Scarcity is they're starting to have to adjust their own processes over there to account for more normalized water scarcity. I think what ultimately we're going to see is that whether or not we have governmental mandates put in place, we're going to be forced ultimately to make adjustments in how we operate and what's considered the new norm.
Yeah, you know what I think is happening? You know, we all despair a little bit of the federal government, and my attitude is I'll take any good thing that comes out of it and then not worry about the rest.
Right.
But there is a kind of to kind of crib from the former President George W. Bush, there's a kind of coalition of the willing on climate that's emerging. That consists of the states like this one, Vermont, which is very advanced, states like California, states like where I live in Maryland. We have strong climate programs. The Chinese are choking themselves to death, and now, last year they installed more solar energy than any other country in the world.
But I have a counterpoint to that.
Okay.
To China.
The Pentagon is now in the leadership of transition to renewable energy because, you know, they're spending all this money, treasure, and lives getting fuel to the troops in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. So they realize the value of being able to generate it right there. There's Germany, of course, and a large part of Europe. It's not easy. It's not a road that anybody's built into a super highway where you can say, I'm on the on-ramp and I know I'll come out in San Francisco on the other side and it's all going to be smooth sailing. That's not the way it is. It'll be a little bit of a tough slog, but I think that there is no doubt in my mind that we can have a reasonable, democratized energy future that's not in control of OPEC or large oil companies or you know, we need utilities, we need the grid. I'm not against large companies, but it needs to be rebalanced in favor of control by families, communities, and individuals, which it hasn't been. And I think that possibility exists today.
And that's interesting as well. We'll talk about the issue of decentralization from a utility standpoint because that affects the whole net metering argument.
Yes.
And again, this topic that we're talking about is so broad and there's so many branches in which we could go, and I kind of want to stay a little bit on topic, speaking specifically to your roadmap, your policy in this book that you wrote in 2007. And I just want to put highlight that you wrote that at a time where America, this kind of preceded the time, our new energy revolution that's going on here in America, in terms of I guess the frack boom that's going on out west, and now with the influence of cheap natural gas, how that may have affected policies that were written prior to this whole boom and how that's affecting our international relations. But anyway, if you could just walk me through a little bit this roadmap that you've proposed?
Right. So in 2006, I was at an energy conference, and my former boss and mentor and dear friend, David Freeman, who I think is the father of energy policy in this country. I worked for him in the early 70s in Washington, mid-70s. And he made a speech which shocked me. He said, we should get rid of oil. Now, this is a man who has run utilities. He was chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority, was chairman of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Here in this area, the New York public power system. So he knows utilities, and he made this quite radical speech. He said we should get rid of nuclear, we should get rid of oil, we should get rid of coal, and we should go to solar. This was 8 years ago, when solar was still very expensive. And I went up to him and I said, you know, you're going to send every industry we have left to China. So that's what I literally said. And he said, you're just being a knee-jerk naysayer. You haven't done a study. Why don't you do a study and then tell us what your findings are? So I went into carbon-free, nuclear-free, very skeptical myself that my conclusion would be not only that it's technically possible, it's been technically possible for a long time. The key question is, what will it cost? Because you can put a solar PV on your battery and enough batteries and you'll be okay.
So cents per kilowatt, it's all going to boil down to cents per kilowatt.
Or dollars per gallon, whatever, dollars per mile, or whatever. And I was surprised to conclude myself that we're living in the midst of an energy revolution. Not all the pieces were ready-made. As I said, there was no on-ramp and a superhighway. But I could see a path that we could chart ourselves. We would have to build this road. It would be a tough slog, but we had all the pieces. We knew all the pieces that it would take to get there. And so the first element, which I have been on since 1970, is efficiency. We use energy so inefficiently. And if I might give you a couple of examples.
Absolutely.
Okay, so here in this neighborhood, over in the neighboring state, just to the east of here, there's New Hampshire. There's a house that was called Hanover House. You can Google it, Hanover House. I encourage you to do it. It was built in the 1990s by somebody who cared a lot. He built a very tight house. He knew where south was. So it's not rocket science, as they say. You have to know where south is, and you have to care about it when you build your house. Very tight windows. His house had lots of extra features, like cherry wood was used for this and that and the other. But he had a solar water heater, a 1,200-gallon tank, I think. And he just, when he needs extra heat, that water in that tank, which is underground, is heated by grid electricity. His energy footprint, external energy footprint, is only 15% of a normal house.
8,300 BTUs per square foot versus
So we know what we can do. So when you can build a passive house, in Germany they do it routinely, for 5 to 10% more than the cost of a regular house, that will eliminate 70+% of the energy footprint. Even when you need air conditioning, you can eliminate 70%. The Hanover House doesn't have air conditioning. So we need to fix up our existing houses. I was very pleased to see that in Manchester, many, many houses have put up new windows and tighter windows and fixed up their older houses because it's cheaper to do it.
Oh, and it's also a function. There are some subsidies, some incentives that are in place on a state level and also a federal level, and which has, I think, helped that program certainly.
Yeah, right, and I think if we direct those incentives properly, the public gets it. You have a lot more reliable energy system. You have to give less subsidies in terms of low-income people not being able to pay their bills, and so right now, for instance, where I live in Maryland, not only are there subsidies for people who can't pay their energy bills so they wouldn't be able to heat their houses. When they do that, they often ask the landlords whether they can insulate the houses so next year the energy bills are lower. And I think there's a big public benefit that comes from those kind of programs. So efficiency is first. Let me give you another example. We're all very fond of our cars. Car is about, when you include all the stoplights and, the stop and start driving and starting from cold and so on, it's about 15–20% efficient. The engine itself at peak efficiency is 30% efficient, but averagely it's about 15–20% efficient. That's what the amount of fuel you use and the amount of power at the wheels of the car.
Is that the combustion engine itself or the entire system?
The combustion engine, the transmission, and
Okay.
you know, till the
So we're not
till you get to the
designing
wheels
our
of
we're
the
not
car.
designing our driving systems, our combustion systems in an efficient manner.
Oh, it's actually very amazing that it works that efficiently. In the old, it's, you know, thermodynamics, it's a very punishing business to turn heat into mechanical energy. Even coal-fired nuclear power plants are only 33% efficient. That's it. And coal-fired power plants, modern, can be 40, gas can be 60. But, you know, we only have a 150, 200-pound person in the car. Sometimes you have two people, so 300, 400 pounds. Okay. But we're moving around 3,000 pounds of steel. So the net efficiency of actually moving the person is closer to 1 or 2%. You take these lights. We used to have incandescent lights. Only 3% of the electricity translates into visible light.
Right.
The rest of it is heat. Compact fluorescents are 10% efficient.
But let me just, on the car issue there, yes, we've got steel, a steel body, 3,000 pounds, but steel is a strong protective material in case we get into an accident.
Right.
It also may be cheaper than, say, using aluminum. There are also other considerations in designing a car beyond just the efficiency of the engine and how many miles per gallon we get.
Totally
However,
right.
they all have to be considered, and I think one of the things that you did point out, and one of the things that I've been doing a lot of reading about, is that we have made substantial gains in terms of fuel economy.
We have.
And a lot of that has been driven by both the market, when we've seen gas at $140 a barrel, as well as by federal mandates. So I think there is some good there, but you're right. When you look at it, on its own, the fact that each of us is driving in this 3,000 or 2,000 pound vehicle to get from point A to point B is highly inefficient, but that's also a product of how we've designed the United States.
and every other country
and our highway
has done
system,
the same.
and our relatively cheap
right,
gas
right,
relative
right,
to...
absolutely. And everybody wants to do the same. So I'm not against having cars and highways and so on. I've got one. So it's not an issue in terms of principle. I live in the suburbs because we had good schools and, all that. Okay. It gives you certain advantages. And I think, so you're absolutely right that, if you're going to drive a car, you need a solid steel frame. And aluminum might work now. Ford might argue with you about the steel versus aluminum, given the truck they've
Right.
come out with. But you have to balance four different things when you're designing a vehicle. You have to balance efficiency, you have to balance safety, you have to balance pollution, environmental impact, and cost. So and cost, of course, there's a running cost and a capital cost. So when you have a more efficient car, your running cost goes down. So one of the advantages of electric cars is you get about 3 miles or 4 miles per kilowatt hour, and a kilowatt hour costs, 16 cents around here, or something like that. So it costs 4 cents a mile to drive, or 4 cents a mile to drive an electric car, and it costs, 10, 12 cents a mile to drive a gasoline car. So you reduce the cost on one end and increase it on the other end. But I completely agree. You can always make a tinny car that's going to be very unsafe and, it's no good to you if you're dead or
Trade-off.
disabled. Yeah. So I think there should be very strong safety standards. It's not incompatible to do these things together. I'm also coming to the view that we really need to make other forms of transportation much safer than they are. Bicycling is much too unsafe today because of the way we do it. We owe bicyclists more space and reserved space with curbs that separate them.
We have to get more people
from
out
the
on
traffic.
bicycles, too. We have to get more people out on bicycles, too.
But I think that would happen if bicycling were safer. I think bicyclists don't pay enough attention to cars, and cars don't pay enough attention to bicycles. And it's an amazing number of people bicycle, and more power to them. I mean, if you go to San Francisco, you see even in this hilly
You go to
city,
the Netherlands. Yeah, it's a good argument, and I agree with you. and that works in certain geographic areas.
Right.
I personally think our larger challenge is just getting people to buy a bike or you know, get out there and do the exercise it's going to take.
Right.
I mean, we're very tethered to our cars in this society, and it's ingrained in U.S. culture, unfortunately. And I think, and I do believe you're right. The safety issue is a primary issue, but also, again, I'm going to revert back to the fact that we're a car culture. And it's very, very difficult to change these habits, unfortunately, and it's going to probably be driven by higher gasoline prices and a number of other factors.
I'm not for that. I'm not, you know, a lot of environmentalists say we should have gasoline taxes. I'm not for that, because I think gasoline taxes are pretty inequitable. I mean, maybe there's an argument for somewhat higher taxes, you know, but I think the best way to attack the car issue. This is a big country, so it's not a densely populated country where you can more easily put in public transport to serve large segments of the population. I mean, half the people in New York City don't have cars because it's a very dense city. Even wealthy people, I know some people are very well off.
It doesn't work to get around in a car in New York.
Yeah, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
And so I know even wealthy people who could well afford a car and could well afford the garage. They don't have cars because you can jump in a cab, and that's part of the public transportation. You can go in the subway, and that's part of the public transportation. You can walk, you can bicycle, and bicycle city has become more bicycle friendly in the Bloomberg years. So we need to attack each problem very thoughtfully from a people point of view, in addition to an environmental point of view. So I'm not a kind of one criterion person that, you know, you have environment, climate is a very big problem, carbon dioxide. So that's not the way we need to think about this. That's why I said, you know, we need to think about how is this going to affect low-income people? How is it going to affect indoor pollution? How is it going to affect outdoor pollution? Can we have a sustainable system that's sustainable environmentally, but also economically and socially? That's why my reaction initially was, we can't do a carbon-free, nuclear-free system because it'll cost too much. But then when I researched it, I think it won't cost too much. I think transitioning carefully to a fully renewable system that is efficient, where efficiency is first, won't cost us more than what we're paying for energy today.
And I agree, and I think it's noble. Unfortunately, I think that, you know, we're not in a closed system here. And as a country, there's the whole issue of being competitive. And, you know, we have industrial constituencies which are putting a lot of pressure on governments to say, hey, listen, we have to compete with China. We have to compete with India or Europe in various ways. And if not everyone is playing by the same rules, could we potentially be disadvantaged by having to adhere to, you know, only purchasing energy from solar and wind grids, or, you know, at, you know, 7 cents an hour higher than, and those are, again, and I'm not just saying that this is, I'm just putting this into the debate.
And if we're serious about economics, it needs to be in the center of the debate. So I'm not your normal environmentalist. You know, we need to worry about the cost. So let's take this issue of India and China first. So they're not the rules made by India or China. They're rules made by the United States.
Yes.
Right? The World Trade Organization was a conversion of what was called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or GATT, which was put in place after World War II, much to the reluctance of many countries that were then becoming independent, that wanted a little bit walled off so they could have a little time to develop. Just like England and the United States had walled themselves off, they had protection, they had tariffs, they had this, they had that, the other. The others wanted the same thing, but in the sort of American century, it was very difficult for them to make that stick. And the World Trade Organization, so first of all, it didn't come from the American people, I don't think. It didn't come from the unions, it didn't come from the workers, it didn't come from people, the textile workers in New York who wanted to see their jobs exported to China and Cambodia. No, it came from the large corporations that wanted to take advantage, not just cheap labor. It happened when cheap labor got married with infrastructure. So when these countries started getting electricity and so on, and institutional infrastructure, when they were allowed to take home their profits. So that's why you don't see the cheapest labor countries necessarily having the most foreign investment. So first of all, we have to remember that they are American rules. We like to go to Walmart to shop and cheap goods, but at the same time, we like to keep all our jobs, and they're not.
Right.
They're not in conflict. So we have to be a little bit more thoughtful. So that's point number one.
Well, I think they are in conflict to some extent.
They are in conflict.
I mean, the fact that, we've exported a lot of our jobs overseas, and now we're of course, we're to some extent forced, or we seek lowest cost goods, and that's all we're thinking about. Maybe not thinking about the fact that buying lower priced goods is perpetuating this offshoring of cheap manufacturing jobs.
There are vicious circles. We throw away too much. Things don't last. They're not robust. They're cheap manufacturing. So, there's a kind of a vicious cycle, and there's a virtuous cycle, and getting out of a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle is tough.
Yes.
My other point is, the main point of reference in this debate should not be India and China. Because if we're going to say, let's compete with India and China, that's a part of that vicious circle. You're in the race to the bottom. You don't want to be in a race to the bottom. You want to help them be in a race to the top. So I'm all for having good corporate standards that are mandated. Why should the same corporation that can have less pollution here have more pollution in China or India?
But that's not up to us. That's up to China.
It's up to the rules of the international game. How is the World Trade Organization set up?
Does the WTO have teeth?
The WTO has plenty of teeth, but not in relation to safety, not in relation to environment, not in relation to workers. And the WTO was created largely by the West. Now the WTO can't be changed by the West alone, because now there are other bigger actors. Now China is a bigger actor than it was in 1979, or even in the 1990s. But the WTO can be changed. The thing is, the people who are driving the WTO, all the people who matter, who gather in Switzerland every year to have their billionaires conversations, they don't care about these issues, even though their properties in Florida and wherever are going to be at risk, because they can always build a property someplace else. I think that at least an unconscious frame of mind. We have to make sure that if there are these international agreements, that worker safety, living wages, environmental standards. My simple solution for this is multinational corporations should have to obey the same rules of best practices in every country they operate, period.
I think that's noble and great. However, and of course we've got a president who's trying to fast-track trade authority, as you're aware of, and he's having a lot of difficulty with that, but which does espouse a number of those guidelines that you just mentioned. Of course, there are a lot of other issues, I think, with this this particular legislation, and I think he's going to have trouble with it. But, going back to China.
Let's go back to energy.
Okay, yeah, like I said.
we can go back to China.
Let's stay on energy.
I've studied economics a fair amount.
Well, so did I, but I'm sure you're much more.
No, it's fine. we can do either. Whatever you like.
Well, I just want to make a point about what's interesting about China is you had mentioned they do have a massive investment in solar. However, they also just committed to like 800 million tons of new coal production. And I think they're going to be dealing with substantial issues, health issues with pollution, which ultimately the citizenry are going to drive China's decision-making, not the World Trade Organization.
Well, we wish they were driving it more, right? Yes. Because the citizenry is actually not in the future going to suffer. They're already suffering. And it's not just a certain segment of the city. Everybody in Beijing has to breathe that air, although it's unequal. Somehow it won't happen smoothly, but we will stumble there. My point about where the United States public should be looking in terms of an example is not India and China. How we should think about U.S. competitiveness in an age where it's hard to change these rules is not China, but Germany. So if you look at Germany's relations with China, they have an export surplus with China.
Germany has an export surplus with most countries.
Yeah. So they treat their workers pretty well. They are much more unionized than the United States. They have universal health insurance. They have quite a lot of benefits, and their living standard is very comparable. Although I think in terms of these ordinary things, maybe better. The life expectancy, maternal mortality, all of those kinds of indicators. Now, Germany's approach is to run hard to stay ahead. They're not happy by making the car with big fins that everybody loves today. So that was good for the 50s.
Innovation.
When I was a boy in Bombay, I wanted a 1954 Cadillac convertible more than anything else. I wasn't worried about gas guzzlers. I was 9 years old.
Right.
So I really wanted that thing. And so it was something that Americans created, that Detroit created, that everybody wanted, but didn't run to stay hard ahead of the curve. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example that not in the energy field. So in the 70s and 80s, as the 90s wore on, the Japanese learned how to make wonderful lenses and electronics and started coming up with cheap cameras that work very well. And everybody buys Japanese cameras. You buy your Canons and Panasonics and all this. And they even have gotten German lenses with the Leica lenses. You can buy a Lubitz cheap camera with,
There's nothing cheap about Leica.
Yeah, nothing cheap about. So you can buy a pretty good camera made in Japan with a Leica lens for a couple $100. But if you look at what the Germans did, the people who are the professionals, the people who care about photography, the people who care about the science in which lenses are involved with their livelihoods, they all want German machines. So I had a friend who runs a furniture factory in Bombay. He makes furniture for businesses, offices and so on. And he bought new machines. I said, okay, so where did your machines come from? He said, German machines. They never break down. They're very hardy. They're totally reliable, and I know I can deliver. When I was down in the research for a nuclear waste repository in France, we were asked to do a review of their nuclear. Now, this is a research laboratory that's underground. There's this giant tunneling machine. Now, you can't have two of those. It's hard to get it out of that mine. It's a German machine.
Right.
So, because you want something sturdy, reliable, precise, you want it to do exact. So they run very hard to stay ahead of the manufacturing curve. We're not running very, we talk about it a lot, but we're not running very hard to stay up.
And interesting to kind of close this loop here and bring this back to energy. What is interesting about Germany very recently is they're starting to back away from their nuclear reliance.
Oh yeah, they have
Germany's historically, much of Europe, as you know, has historically been very reliant on nuclear energy. Again, because they viewed nuclear as a good carbon-free alternative, even though there are externalities to it, of which you are very versed in, and that's the disposal and various other issues. And hopefully we'll have time to touch on that at another time. But I just thought, that was interesting. And all as a result of Fukushima, of course.
Right. Now, I think it was not necessarily an unreasonable decision when the Europeans decided to do nuclear. I'm not ideological about this. So part of their problem wasn't fossil fuel emissions or anything like that. In 1973, during the oil crisis and the embargo and prices shooting up, in this country, only about 10% of the electricity generation was with oil. So we had the transportation, of course, that was a big headache when prices shot up. In France, the transportation was oil. There was a huge amount of oil in industry, as there is everywhere. But much of their electricity generation was also. So they had like a triple whammy. They had a whammy to industry, they had a whammy to transportation, they had a whammy in electricity generation.
So they had to decrease consumption.
So they had to find where they're going to get rid of the oil, and the easiest place to do it was by replacing. They already had gotten rid of most of their coal and shut down their coal mines. So they went from oil to nuclear. And the positive message of the French transition to nuclear is not in the technology they chose, because you should choose the technology that's best for the time. It is that when you make a firm, determined decision to change the technology, you can get it done in 25 years, even though it's a huge, huge sector of the economy. They did it in 25 years. We can do it too. We can do it in 25 years.
Transition away from
Yeah,
our
we can
paradigm.
transition to an efficient, renewable economy in 25 years. I used to say 35 years, but technology is proceeding so rapidly. I thought we will not see electric cars on the road to the tune that we are seeing them until 5 years from now when I wrote my book. I thought it'd be closer to 2020. But
Elon Musk.
Absolutely.
Revolutionary.
Yeah. I test drove a Tesla a few weeks ago.
Sat with my friends and I had envy.
It's fabulous.
They're
And, you know, it's $80,000. I can't afford it. I don't know if you can, but I can't afford it. And I told them that. I said, you know, before I test drive it, you have to know I'm not going to buy one. I can't afford it. But
I'll just borrow
they're
it.
going to come out with a $35,000
Yep.
car in 3 years. And that surprised me. You can charge up a Tesla in 30 minutes. So you stop for, you know, a snack and restroom break, and by the time you come back, your car is charged, and you'll be able to drive from coast to coast in a Tesla.
Yeah, he's developing network.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
I mean, what he's doing along with his you know, space missions
Yeah, right,
and
right.
everything
Pretty
else.
fabulous. Okay.
So, talking about this change in paradigm shift in you know, our energy profile, obviously you talk a lot about biofuels, algal-based biofuels. You talk about wind and solar, obviously. I think those are three components. Why don't you just talk a little bit about each one of those components for me?
You know, when we talk about energy, a lot of our attention gets automatically focused somehow on electricity, because solar and wind and renewables and so on. Actually, that's the least difficult part of the transition, because we know how to make electricity in a relatively straightforward way from solar and wind. There's the question of variability, but we can do the electricity.
Turbine.
Yeah. And that's an old technology. Solar has been around for more than half a century, and it's a question of cost, and the costs are coming down very rapidly. In Germany, solar is $2 a watt, unsubsidized. And here, it's going to get there in a couple of years, 3 years. It's going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
20, 30 cents a kilowatt
That's because
hour,
Germany is very bad for solar energy.
Right.
Germany is about the same as Alaska.
It's like solar here in Vermont.
Well, no, Germany is much worse
Really?
than Vermont. Germany is as bad as Alaska on annual average.
Wow.
Seattle is better than Germany. Germany on average. Now, southern Germany is somewhat, you know, comparable to Seattle.
Don't let the Germans know this.
So, yeah, there's a question of transportation fuels, industrial fuels, and heating homes, water heating, businesses. So transportation, I think, a large part of the thinking about this is to move away from combustion into electricity. So where you can electrify something very efficient. Generally, you have a choice of technologies in electricity that you can not only convert the fuel, but you can also make it a lot more efficient. So let me give you an example. So we heat our homes with natural gas. Until recently, I was doing the same. I was heating my homes, and more in New England, or oil.
Or propane.
Or propane. So those are the big fuels in the country. More than 50% is in this country is heated by natural gas and so on. So if you use 100 million BTU of energy, which is fairly typical in a reasonable sized home, annual basis, about your heating requirements are about 80 million BTU. That's the heat that actually goes into the house, and 20 million BTU goes up the stack if you have a normal furnace. Rough numbers. Now, you can improve that efficiency and do the same heating with 85 million BTU if you bought the best available furnace, or 83 million BTU. 98% efficient is available. But you can't do more than 100% efficient by burning natural gas. So much heat comes out, and that's a maximum. However, with electricity, you can do better than 100% because you can do a heat pump. So I have a geothermal heat pump. So the Earth is always at 55 degrees. You get free energy from the Earth. It's not truly free.
Differential between the water temperature and the ambient.
So you circulate antifreeze in this closed loop. It comes up at 55 degrees, and then you have a refrigerant fluid, like a Freon. We don't have Freons anymore because they're ozone depleting, but the equivalent of Freons. And then you pump up that 55 degrees to 100 degrees, and you only have a small margin of pumping up. So for every unit of electricity you pump into that fluid, you get 3 or 4 units free from the earth. So now you have a system that gives you 4 times as much energy as you put into it, because you're using that energy to essentially mine some heat out of the earth, and it will be replenished in your front or backyard.
Great concept on the benefit side.
Right.
On the cost side, however, of course, nothing's free. And I've actually researched this myself when I was building a house. The cost to install, depending on where you live, depending on the geology of where you are too, can be quite enormous.
Is very enormous.
And I think that's one of the challenges that homeowners face is sometimes the upfront cost. It's difficult to amortize that cost over the lifetime of receiving the payout, the benefits. And so that's why a lot of people kind of hit a brick wall when they see those numbers.
So I should have brought my computer so I could have shown you that in preparation for the workshop tomorrow here in Manchester, I did some calculations for Vermont. So here's a natural gas heated house. So I used Department of Energy estimates for heating and cooling requirements for a typical home in Vermont, a single family home in Vermont. And so I did out a calculation. Natural gas, oil, same house, natural gas, oil, electric resistance heating, a regular heat pump.
Wood pellets.
And I didn't do wood pellets. Okay. So I did an electricity conversion. So if we're going to go to renewables, solar and wind, then, or hydro, then you do an electric transition. So I didn't do the whole universe of possibilities. Wood is an important fuel in Vermont, I know, and could be managed renewably. And the best available air-to-air heat pump and geothermal heat pumps. Now geothermal, so the costs are, a regular heat pump will cost you $5,700, and an Energy Star will cost you $6,700. The best available will cost you $12,000, and a geothermal heat pump will cost you $27,000.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's the landscape that you now when you do, if you're an above average income person and pay a fair amount of federal taxes. So the way we've arranged our incentives is toward upper income people. So we're shutting out many low income people. So if you pay enough federal taxes and spend $27,000 on your heat pump, the federal government will refund you $8,100. Now where I live in Maryland, the state government will give you $3,000. Vermont, you probably have an incentive for geothermal heat pumps. By the time you're said and done, it'll cost you $15,000, $16,000. But you have to put up the cash, 27.
Right.
So when I did the numbers and said, so okay, what's the net value over a long period of time? Geothermal heat pumps are pretty economical. The best, the $12,000 heat pump, which is not that, prohibitively expensive, performs better and will save you more money over the long term. The big question is, how do you finance it? Not everybody can lay out $12,000 or $27,000. So this is an issue of public policy. And I think 2 approaches are available. One is we should not be throwing away energy, money, carbon dioxide. We should mandate that new houses have the equivalent heating system of a geothermal heat pump, unless they are renewable in some other way, like wood or solar thermal, like Hanover House is renewable with solar thermal. So some set of rules that the builder doesn't necessarily care, what your energy bills are going to be. It's a split incentive. They sell you the granite counter and they sell you the azaleas in the front yard, whatever. So I think we need rules, just like we need efficiency standards for cars, we need efficiency standards for homes. We have efficiency standards for appliances. They have worked fabulously well. Can I detain you a minute on efficiency standards?
Absolutely.
In 1972, when I first started working for David Freeman in Washington, D.C., a frost-free refrigerator of 18 cubic feet consumed 1,800 kilowatt hours a year. So the math is simple, about 100 kilowatt hours per cubic foot per year, 100, 1, 1. Then we had California's efficiency standards in the late 70s, and then we had federal efficiency standards, and they have been tightened over time Today, if you go to the store, an Energy Star refrigerator consumes only about 400 kilowatt hours. And it'll be likely to be 20 or 22 cubic feet. So 80% of the energy footprint of a refrigerator has been eliminated. It is likely a better performing refrigerator. It's certainly safer. It doesn't have those handles that close like that, so children don't get locked up inside. That used to happen sometimes. The lesson is that for certain things where there's competition in the marketplace and it's technologically possible, the kicker here is the refrigerators are cheaper today, better performing, 80% more efficient, and cheaper. So I think we can do the same for houses. Overall, maybe a few percent more expensive, but plus utility bills cheaper. But we need to require it. What about existing houses? That's the big. And that's where things like Green Bank, some incentives, working with contractors, making sure that low-income people have the low-interest loans, on-bill financing, so you don't have to lay out all the cash, but you pay for it through your... Now, the federal government is holding up this property tax approach where you can pay for it through your property taxes, you know, because...
touchy subject here.
Yeah, it's a touchy subject because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac... Yeah, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac don't like it, and they say, well, if there's foreclosure, we want it first. California has sent a note to the federal government that's interesting. I don't know where it'll wind up, but they've said, we're going to set up a pool of money to guarantee these mortgages in case of foreclosure. So that, but we would like to do these things through property tax assessments. There are creative approaches to doing this, so people don't have to lay out $15,000 or $20,000 or $25,000. And in the long term, they will save a lot of money. We will save a lot of headache and CO2. They perform better. But we're not able to get these things into place.
They do perform better, and they do save CO2 over here in the United States. But I think the other side of that story is that the reason they're cheaper, with the exception of GE, which I think is bringing Maytag back to the United States, a lot of our appliances are built, again, go back to this issue, they're built overseas, and they're built overseas using cheaper labor, probably getting electricity from a coal-fired power plant. So the carbon savings on this end, on the consumption end...
Let me stop you there. I think geothermal heat pumps are made in the United States.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was talking about your dishwashers and appliances.
Yeah,
like
right.
Yeah.
But I do not believe there are dishwashers and appliances that are made in Germany.
That's true.
And we buy dishwashers.
So
I think we've got too much of a mindset on we've got to compete with. And this has been drilled into us because it's this drumbeat that workers have to accept lower wages and, and so on and so on and so on.
I'm not saying that. I'm not
export. No, I'm not saying that you're doing that. I'm saying the big corporations kind of want to force down wages here under the threat of exporting their jobs to China. And I'm not against China having manufacturing. I'm not against trade. No, I'm not. What I am for is that there should be reasonable wages, living conditions, safety. There should be. We have a global system. We're not going to be able to go back from this global system. It's been 500 years in the making. We have an international... I have roots in 4 countries all by myself. Now, so we live not only in an economically globalized world. Look at, in Vermont, you probably have 100 different people from 100 different countries living just in this one small state. So I think there's a wonder to the diversity of the world. There's a wonder to cultural mixture. You grow, you learn, you speak 5 languages. I think that's great. I speak 5 languages. So it's fine. It's wonderful. We have to learn to stop the underside of that, which is not driven by internationalization. It's driven by the way it was done, which was If I, by the starting with the East India Company and the Virginia Company and grabbing other people's land and grabbing other people's labor and grabbing their food and grabbing their textiles and grabbing this and grabbing that, well, that's a culture in which the current economic system grew up.
Mm-hmm.
We need to fix that.
We're running out of time, and
sure.
I would actually love to have you come back here again, because there's so much we
Let's
didn't
talk
even
about the
touch
global
on.
economy.
But I just want to end on this one note. You
Yeah.
did say in your book, I think this is very important, it will take vision and political courage to enact tough policies. And I think
Right.
ultimately everything we've talked about
Right.
all comes back to policies, and
Right.
and it will indeed be a heavy lift. And but ultimately, Doctor, it's been very fortunate for me, and I'm humbled to have you here, and I know
Well,
for
no,
all our
please don't be.
viewers.
It's been a pleasure for me to talk to you, and we've covered the world of issues.
But we're not done
You've
yet. I
been a
hope,
very
I
good
hope you
host.
come back again.
Yeah, I'll
and
come back.
thank you, folks, and
Sure.
please come back for part 2. Again, I'm Stephen Drunsic, and this is Q&A Live.